during those 3 or 4 days I'm in town, I'm using my Netflix, right? So
Right.
I don't think they want that use case to go away, but I do
Right.
think they want to crack down on Uncle Eddie in Massachusetts or Minnesota. I don't want to give them any clues. Should throw them off a little bit. Uncle Eddie accessing my account, so
Uh-huh.
which is interesting because it's always nice to pop into Uncle Eddie's and see what he's watching. It's like, really? Fried green tomatoes? Continue watching?
I feel like that was one of those, was it fried green tomatoes or was it steel magnolias? It was one of those like early ones realizing, oh, I'm the sensitive kid who the uncles is upset that they're watching this movie and like feeling feelings. Like you're a boy, you're not supposed to feel these feelings. I feel like that was like the early 90s litmus test was those movies.
Yeah, actually, I think so. Fried green tomatoes is the one where they eat the bad guy, right? I mean, it's funny you don't think about it, but like that they do. They eat it's like Goodbye Earl, right? By the Dixie Chicks.
See,
They basically
this is the problem with only having seen this movie when I was like 6 or 7 or something. Like, I don't actually remember. I just remember, isn't it? Oh, what's her face? She's got 3 names. She was in Weeds.
yes,
Mary
yes.
Louise Parker.
Yeah, and the bit that everyone forgets is that they barbecue the guy and then they feed him to the town, right? So
Is that true?
yeah, the husband is abusive. She
Sure.
leaves, right?
Right.
And then it's not actually the friend and the wife who killed the guy, but the guy ends up dead. To get rid of him, they barbecue him and feed him to the patrons.
Okay, I feel like I would have remembered that, or maybe.
It's glossed over. I think you're talking about Steel Magnolias, which is like the 97 friends, one of them,
Right.
and
Yeah.
kids are involved. And hey, I love you well enough, I'm going to raise your kids. It's one of
Sure.
those. And I haven't even seen it. I'm guessing. I'm guessing it's got Julia Roberts in or something like that, right? Is
I
it?
believe that is a Julia Roberts one.
I am so good at this. This is why I don't. Yeah, Julia Roberts, Shirley MacLaine. I mean, it's
Yep.
pretty
It's a good
powerful.
cast.
It's a Golden
Yeah.
Girls cast, right?
I feel like Julia Roberts was pretty young at that point, but sure.
Sally Field, I love.
Sure.
Olympia Dukakis, great name. Just great name. Daryl Hannah. Yeah, it's like the Golden Girls cast.
I don't know that you're using that term correctly.
No, I'm trying to coin it. It's when you've got like this big female ensemble of power.
Sure, you're trying to take an existing phrase for a show about women in their 60s and repurpose it to mean
I'm
something
sorry.
new for the modern era.
I'm sorry. Are you American? Have you watched the recycled Hollywood crap? You're supposed to do that. When everybody dies off, it's okay to repurpose that. We can't leave Golden Girls associated with this old show nobody knows about, right? I get to repurpose
Nobody knows
it.
about. Okay.
Betty White, she's dead. She was the last one, right?
She was.
And it was long enough ago that it's not too soon. So we can repurpose Golden Girls.
I do like that Betty White lived long enough for People magazine to put her on the cover celebrating her 100th birthday and then died like a week before her 100th birthday so that the People magazine cover still had to go out and was wrong. She clearly didn't do that on purpose, but I do enjoy the comedic timing of that is fantastic.
You enjoy the timing of her death. That's how you're going to justify what you just said.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we can all do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the chat from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. We're also here to get deeper on the human elements. I could go on for an eternity about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of two better people to get to that than Kevin and I.
I mean, that's not nice to lie to our listeners, but okay. On this week's show, we'll be looking at a few examples of software failures and the massive consequences of those mistakes, including a $440 million stock trading mistake and the deaths of 78 people from faulty software in cars. But first, an update on the UK post office scandal that we started to talk about back in episode 6. I think there's a number of things that have started to come out as the public has paid more attention and understood that actually there's an ongoing government inquiry that started before the TV show dropped, and now we're starting to see what's coming out of that inquiry inquiry and the way the government has been responding previous to the television show and people being more aware of it. And I'll be curious to see if things improve as that public scrutiny is probably going to help the victims of this. But unfortunately, the next phase of that government inquiry doesn't start until April. And yet, even along the way, the post office has been dragging its feet and delaying things and doing some truly, it sounds like Alan Bates got a payout offer from the post office that was insulting. And of course, they haven't done anything else with it. So yeah, fingers crossed that, public scrutiny means the next couple of months are going to be better news for folks, but pretty upsetting the timelines of these things. Obviously, it's been going on for decades. Alan Bates has been fighting this for at least a decade. They initially got a settlement, but then that settlement didn't actually overturn any of the convictions. Now they've had this inquiry going on since I think 2021 maybe, but the pace of this is just incredibly frustrating and slow.
We say in the intro, right? The human element is fairly evident to the listeners. That's why I always come back to the human element. These public inquiries they're difficult for me to stomach because there's a conflict of interest for anybody involved, right? Let's go with the government workers and Horizon staff. You know the end game, right? You know the minute you accept the accountability, that is your career. And it's also public, the public outing to your part of this massive mess that has gone on for years, right? So the longer it goes on, the bigger the fall when you're finally outed in public as having some accountability in that. It's almost like you would want to delay that, right? I wonder like how much of the human element comes into play, because when you're looking at the ministers and executives at the on the private side, there's definitely a sense of like, is it in their best interest to be stepping up and sort of falling on their sword?
There was an interesting comment from someone on the government side trying to distance themselves from the post office. The post office is barely related. It is, a secondary function, privately managed, and the government really didn't have anything to do with it. And then, there is a government minister who sits on the board of the post office who, whether they knew or not, I think some of these horrifying decisions that the post office was making over the past 2 decades to prosecute people and send them to jail for the result of faulty software and bugs. Someone, I mean, again, I don't care if you did know, you're at the top of the food chain. The buck has to stop somewhere. And what culture were you building up that you thought the correct solution was to let Fujitsu tell you that software was flawless? When has software ever been flawless? And you all decided to prosecute people for it. So it's this weird mix of the government trying not to say that they had anything to do with it, and yet everyone would think of the government as being responsible for the post office, and they have a seat on that board. I don't know. It's a weird. Is this a result of the 90s and everything in the 90s trying to switch to the neoliberal scenario where it's a public-private partnership and the post office is privatized into this quasi-government institution? It's a weird situation, and yeah, I think it's a conflict of interest a lot of the times.
I'm seeing on the Exaverse, is that what it's called now? The Exaverse? Instead of the
What is
Twitterverse?
that?
Instead of the Twitterverse, the Exaverse?
Oh, horrifying.
Yeah. Fortunately, we're seeing from my conversations with some of the academics on X, they're starting to recycle this story back into academia, right? So one of the people who got back to me was, I won't mention the universities, but two major universities in the UK actually have exposed their students to elements of the story, which is good. I love that. I always feel like academia can sometimes be a little bit high level, not practical application, examination of real affairs. But it's nice to see that decades didn't have to go by before somebody recycled this into the education system. And so those kids will get a good view of all that theoretical they're getting. This is what happens when you actually don't follow the rules. So
I think the last thing that I thought was interesting was a story from one of the expert IT witnesses who was brought in as part of one of the legal suits. And this was a couple of years ago, so the post office didn't face the sort of public scrutiny that they're facing now. But the lengths to which the post office went to keep the expert IT witness from actually being able to examine the Horizon software system was ridiculous. So the judge used the word, I think observe maybe was the word that the judge used. And so when the expert went to the post office headquarters to look at the mock store and play around with the software, the lawyers there for the post office said, well, the word observe means you can't touch anything. You can't, or investigate. Maybe the word was investigate.
It was actually inspect.
Inspect.
Yeah,
there
to
you go.
inspect the system.
And that's just, and so the lawyers would get into this ridiculous game where the guy would say, okay, well, can I go enter some information on the computer? No. A post office person can follow your instructions. And so he was doing this weird game of telephone where he'd say, okay, enter this command. The post office worker would ask their manager would ask the lawyers would decide whether or not they could do that thing. And it was this constant chain of just delay tactics, basically, to prevent this expert from actually being able to look at the system. And the only reason that the expert actually was able to do the research that they needed to do was because they found some retiring sub postmaster who was like, sure, come into my shop and take a look at the stuff. And the expert was actually able to go and mess around and create the same conditions that would cause these bugs to arise. It's just a perfect example of it wasn't innocent mistakes. It wasn't a genuine belief in these sub postmasters committing fraud. The lawyers understood we can't let the expert actually look at the software. Someone somewhere understood it's broken down. Fujitsu is lying to us and we need to cover our ass. Or we know, who knows what, but for some reason, the post office lawyers knew not to let an expert poke around in the software, and that's pretty damning. That's not great. And if you find yourself in a situation in which you're trying to defend your software company from situations where people have died, hundreds have gone to jail, thousands are financially ruined, and the lawyer's telling you, don't go and do that. Like, I get that lawyers have their job to protect the legal interests, but there's also a moral factor in this, and I don't know how you stay in that job afterwards. That's rough. All right, well, let's take a short break and we'll be right back with other examples of how software can go horribly wrong and have significant real world consequences. It's a bit of a bummer of an episode, maybe. I don't know. We should find these are at least in order of least severe to most severe, so we can start making fun of people at the start of it at least.
Yeah,
I don't know.
you know, no, you know
It's a
me
heavy
because
topic. It's a heavy
it's
topic.
yeah, and you know me, I like to play both sides on this because I'm all about the progress, and I argue both sides on this one because with AI, I'm all ready to go into the future, knowing that things like this will happen if we're not careful. But then I'm also very critical of where did the science go in computer science? It was never really truly a science, but there was some science there, right? This first one's interesting. If it's the one I'm thinking that you're going to start with, this one's interesting where I could argue both sides to this.
Yeah, we'll get there. All right, we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call Market Analysis, where we'll look at product or app or technology and talk through our impressions, how we think some of the product and engineering decisions were made to arrive at how the thing works, and share our thoughts on how good or bad we think it is. So today we're going to cover a few examples of these. Originally, do we think the software engineers always understood the trade-offs that they were making? When we get to Toyota, I think we can get into a pretty good discussion about that. But at the start, in the software world, do you understand the scope of impact and the results that can happen? I don't know that everyone thinks about it that way. So let's dive in. The first one is the title of the article was "Cheating Frenchman Sues Uber for Tipping Off Wife About Affair." This was back in 2017. He was logged into his Uber account on his wife's phone and then logged out of her phone and into that account on his phone. And the bug from Uber sent the ride notification to both phones. So she got suspicious and understood he was having an affair as a result, and they're now divorced. So he sued them for I think like $45 million, euros, whatever it was, because it caused the end of his marriage, which I will say we're starting light on this one on the scope of bugs. Not great, but also, buddy, this one fully on you. Maybe don't have the
Yeah.
affair.
Well, there's a couple of challenges on this one for me is where did they come up with that number?
Right, how is his marriage worth $45 million?
45 million. And here's the danger on this one, and here's why I'm going to play both sides, right? Like, yeah, shame on Uber, classic mistake. I want to get into the ethics because that's a weird one where I don't think I could argue, hey, this is going to keep us honest, right? Like, shame on you. That book is making the world a better place. No, but I will say this: it's really dangerous now because at $45 million a pop, do people like you and I who understand technology start to find some interesting ways of drumming up lawsuits for fairly trivial bugs that through manipulation could be seen to be damaging? Like, hey, now my employer knows I'm looking for a job because this popped up in here and that should not have been able to happen because of this bug. And now all of a sudden I'm suing for damages of lost earnings. Like, what?
I think the problem I have with that argument is it's a Trojan horse usually used by corporations to prevent any lawsuits. And so whenever I hear scenarios like tort reform and we should get rid of these frivolous lawsuits, the problem is we're going to talk about some of the ones that, Fitbit and others got sued for physical harm. And so I'm almost willing to let the Uber $45 million lawsuit exist so that there's not an avenue to shut down some of the ones we're going to talk about.
But here's the problem, right? The card is not church. So the affair is not important. It is to the man who lost his wife in the divorce.
Why don't you leave that up to the judge and the jury? Isn't that why we have judges and juries, is to let the legal system have that give and take, and that way the guy can try to sue, and yeah, it's going to cost everybody money to do the actual court battle, and you can argue whether or not Uber should have to have $10 million on retainer to be able to even fight these kinds of things off, but in the grand scheme of things,
The same bug exposes the fact he's cheating on his diet. How much is that lawsuit worth? It's not
right,
worth anything, right? It's oh, you cheated on your
right, but
diet. Your wife found out. It's not worth anything, right? Like,
the Tesla driving off the road and running over a cat versus running over a 4-year-old, it's the same bug. I think we should let the system work it out. I think the person whose cat got run over would get 100 grand. I think the person whose 4-year-old got run over would get a couple million. Like, I think the system I think is probably working as well as it can without putting too many restrictions, because my concern is if you prevent the diet and you prevent the affair, well then sure, we should prevent the cat. Cat parents aren't going to be too happy about that. I don't love that I just called them parents, but then the actual parents now are the next on the chopping block. I have no doubt that Elon would be in court arguing that the pace of progress, if it costs a couple of kids' lives, is worth it. I don't love that we would be that you open the door to shutting that down, and I don't love that who gets to close the door and leave certain things still suable.
yeah, I agree with you, but then I'm thinking to myself now, like the sinister engineer who, along with their buddies, figures out, hey, you could do this, right? Yeah, I can put that bug in there, and they did it. Come on, man. Like
Yeah, but people are no. People are too stupid. That's the problem. Discovery is a thing in legal cases for a reason. You morons talked about that in your text messages, and the lawyer for the defendant went and found those and is like, "Oh, actually, that's not Uber's fault. That's Joe's fault." So no. People are morons. In 1 out of 1 million cases, that will work, and if it does, good for them. That's the Office Space scenario. That's Office Space. Well, Office Space screwed up and rounded up too much, but yeah, if you're smart enough to pull it off in a way that doesn't get you caught, I'm actually kind of okay with that, because 100 times, 99 times out of 100, you get caught because people are dumb.
do we need the ethics police here to start helping on some of the context? I wasn't going to go there with this one, but should the ethics police be in there as well and saying, no, this is actually a good thing. You're getting no money. It's getting thrown out. Uber should be congratulated for a job well done.
But the system does that already. The judge throws the case out, or they decide to settle out of court ahead of time. I don't know. The system isn't broken, in my opinion. It's doing what it should do. A jury would have laughed that guy out of the room.
Oh, I don't know if the system. I can't believe anybody would defend the modern justice system as doing what it's supposed
I
to
mean,
do.
I don't mind. I don't see. This is also where I would say there's a difference between criminal court and civil court. I think the criminal courts are pretty messed up and doing really, really bad things, and we won't get into that on this podcast. But civil court, from what I can tell, I don't know, man. I'm kind of okay with big corporations needing to pay up a little bit
Wait a
for
minute.
all
Wait a
the
minute.
stuff that
Wait a
they're
minute.
doing bad.
How much? How much was the payout for the scolding hot McDonald's? That's the big one, right? That was what, 20 years ago, 27 years
Everyone
ago.
is wrong about this. Everyone is wrong about this. She was burned so badly, her labia fused together.
I get
She
that.
was medically ruined by scalding hot McDonald's. And
Yeah.
corporations, the corporate PR spin turned it into, oh, look at this stupid woman. She couldn't understand that coffee was hot. No, McDonald's was providing coffee that was so scalding hot, it physically harmed her through her genes into her crotch in medically devastating ways. She probably, I don't know what amount of money she got, but yeah, she probably deserved it. And the fact that we need to put that warning on there is a side effect that is the actual thing that McDonald's had to do, was reduce the temperature of their coffee. The label on the cup that everyone makes fun of, and she gets made fun of. She shouldn't. The label on the cup, a little bit goofy. The real solution was McDonald's had to change its temperature. So no. That case is golden. It was ruined by corporate PR.
I was just using that as the entry point, right? But since that time, like, come on.
No, you don't get to go, come on. You come out with specific examples where it was actually a thing that was dumb and
That honestly, come on. Like, and we see it during election season, right? Like, there are people not in their right minds, and maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe that's part of it. Is like, you can't use this software; it's too sophisticated for you. Because if you screw it up, it's going to do something bad, and then you're going to want to sue us. Maybe the disclaimer should be in easier language for everybody now.
I mean, we'll get to this on the next story. So the next topic is Google's Nest battery drain. They had a bug where the Google Nest would drain the battery in a matter of hours overnight, and so in December December of 2015, December, middle of winter, version 5.1.3 rolled out and drained a bunch of people's batteries, and then they all woke up to freezing houses. And if you have children, tiny little babies sleeping alone in their cribs, fortunately nothing happened, but not a great example of, again, we're starting on the minor scale of problems here. But the solution, by the way, was a ridiculous 9-step procedure where you had to like unmount it from the wall, plug it into a thing for 15 minutes, mount it back into the wall, then unplug it from the wall again. And like the fix for people was really ridiculous too. And most importantly, you're fortunate in this situation, but we've seen cases of extreme heat and extreme cold kill the elderly and children. And we didn't have that in this situation through a line of coincidence. But even worse, to your point about let's make the service agreement more human readable, the Google Nest service agreement limited users to arbitration, and they were legally prevented by the everyone just checks the yes, I agree to the terms and conditions, and we don't read the 17 pages of legal text. And that legal text is blocking you from suing people for doing bad things to you because lawyers have figured out the courts will accept checking the box as a legal signature and agreeing to terms. And no one reads those, and those should be illegal.
Oh, I don't know if I agree with that. And I also take this back to if this was the waterworks or the heating company or the gas company, like would people view that the same way, right? Like, oh, the electricity went out through the night and our heating stopped working and somebody in the house died. Nobody's talking about suing them. It's this private sector.
Yes, they are. The Texas, no. Yes, they are in Texas. In Texas, the utilities absolutely failed in the winter and the summer because Texas doesn't know how to manage its infrastructure because Republicans don't believe in public service. Of course they sued the utility. Of course they did.
But you're in the US. Sorry, I'm in the UK. We don't have growing up when the services failed. None of us were that naive enough to oh, it's so frustrating. People are sitting on top of complex systems every single day, and they view these devices as brand new. They don't even view the risk. Look at these things I'm introducing to my life, and then they fail, and they're like, man, I didn't know I was sitting on all this risk. You were sitting on that risk for the last 30, 40 years of your life. They didn't fail, but when they do fail, the same bad things happen. This is why people in extreme climates own things like generators and candles and hand warmers. It's like things fail. If you put your heating system on a digital device and then it fails and that's surprising to you, then you wouldn't have understood any of the legal jargon anyway.
Correct. Our world has gotten too complex for the average citizen who aren't engineers like you and are sold and convinced by marketing. That's the next one, Fitbit. Fitbit gets sued by people because Fitbit goes out there telling you that they have a thing that can read your heart rate accurately. And so when the slogan was something about like the healthy pulse or something, like Fitbit's out there in marketing materials telling you that what they're going to do is measure your heart rate, and people trusting the marketing and trusting the thing that they're being told by the company use it to rely on for heart monitoring. And if you have a heart condition and actually the thing's not accurate, you're screwed. And so they sued Fitbit. I don't actually know. The class action was filed in 2016. The motion to dismiss was rejected in 2018, and now I can't find any more information about it, which makes me think they settled out of court. But it's the level of education of the average consumer about the complexity of their world has not gone up, and it hasn't, like, maybe it's gone down. I read letters from like the 1700s and I'm like, they sound smarter than us, but also maybe we're only reading the 400 smart letters that are out there. I don't know. But at minimum, if this is the state of the consumers of the world, then you can't, that's the whole point of holding companies accountable for how they market their products. That's why you're not allowed to be a snake oil salesman anymore. We got rid of that at the end of the 1800s.
As a paranoid father of 5, there is no way I would wake up in the morning and have this one little device be the difference between life and death for my baby, right?
But when the company advertises it as the one little device in the way between life and death for your baby, you as a consumer...
they're not saying that. They're not saying that.
They are absolutely... In the case of Fitbit, they are absolutely telling you...
In the case of Fitbit, and that's my second problem, there is not a system in place today, really, to go through these and make sure when the wave comes, and I think it will, the more lawsuits that we see, when the wave comes, I don't think there's a good system in place to separate the lazy Joe developer versus the, hey, this is actually a cover-up from within, right? This is a conspiracy to get away with murder. I don't know if we have a good system in place. Hence the whole Horizon issue, right?
But that's the point. The system we have in place is working. The system system we have in place is working. The only recourse consumers have is a lawsuit, and the lawsuit forces discovery. And during discovery, you're forcing corporations to prove that they did their due diligence, and this was an unavoidable mistake. And in those situations, the people who sue probably aren't going to be happy that it was Joe's one line of screw up, but that's better than proving that Fitbit knowingly and purposefully cut corners and did a bunch of things. And so the lawsuit is the only mechanism we have to do that. The alternative, there's two alternatives. Nothing. Consumers aren't allowed to try and force and understand what corporations are doing. And right now, I would argue that our penalties are baked in to corporate budgets. And so that the penalties should be higher to scare corporations into doing better sooner. Because right now, Uber just accounts for that in their budget and just moves on. So one, I'm not sure that I think the system right now is actually doing as much as it could, but it at least is a system. The second alternative is we don't do anything. And the third alternative is the government steps in and says, hey, if you're going to offer consumer hardware or software, here are the 6 Sigma steps we expect you to go through every single time. And we have some of that. We have the FDA. We have things that are telling corporations, you can't release a thing to consumers without going through these steps. And I don't think big tech is really going to want the government coming in and telling legally mandated automation testing that has to be involved. I'm open to it. I don't think I could provide a regulatory schema that would make sense and wouldn't be a ton of red tape for a bunch of cases. But those are the 3 options in front of you. I'm curious if you have a fourth, because right now we're using one that slightly works.
No. I think the third one is interesting to me. There's questions I would have about the Nest, which is, am I getting an alarm if there's a system failure? If not, why not? And in this case, you could argue, well, the system might not know it's under a failure. It's like, well, when the temperature drops below a certain rate, then I've got a system failure,
Sure.
right? Do those systems, and that to me is part of that number 3, which is hey, if you're going to do something, it comes back to that mission critical piece. Hey, people are going to use these in their houses, and they're going to rely on them to keep their children alive on a bitterly cold night. So your device must have this safety protocol. The smell of gas, right? The reason why gas has a
Right.
smell is so people know they're about to blow up, right?
Right.
To me, those things work. I'll put that on the big corporations.
And that's fine, but those are federal enforcement of authority granted to agencies. And that mechanism is currently under review by the Supreme Court because there's a pretty good chance that the conservative members of the Supreme Court are about to rule that unless Congress writes an explicit law and that law explicitly calls for that regulation, then the regulatory body is not allowed to do that, which would ruin the FDA, your ability to let the FDA write rules about meat processing plants so that you don't end up eating rat shit. Like, all of
Yeah.
those things are at risk. And so the idea that we're going to then trust a regulatory body governed by whatever president is in office at that time to correctly enforce all of those things, the regulatory system is already in shambles in this country, and now we're hoping that more of that's going to happen. I'm all for it, but it would require a different level of, even Democrats don't do a great job at that these days.
But then I feel like you're picking and choosing little bits of the system to say it was perfectly, but then you introduce this where it's like it doesn't work perfectly. They're the same system to me.
No, but that's what I'm saying right now we have a mechanism through the courts. I wish the courts would enforce higher fines on corporations to make it more of a shock to their system so that the next corporation doesn't need to go to court and puts those things in place, because the alternative is the regulation, and I don't see the regulation typing. I'm not satisfied with any part of this scheme right now. I'm just saying we have something that is partially working.
I want the higher court, but I don't necessarily think that penalizing the corporations, again, that flips our roles. That's reactive, and I actually want to be proactive in this sense, which is
That's fair.
if you have a device that can lead to someone dying, it is mission critical, and it must meet this ISO standard, and it must have whatever in place to make sure that the consumer is best prepared to prevent that from happening, right? Like, I don't know if hitting them with lawsuits, like you say, a lot of them, their insurance, and they've got a pop for this kind of stuff. I actually think we need to update the system.
I will also say that those lawsuits can be the thing that leads federal monitoring agencies to institute new rules. So the lawsuit is the way to surface the fact that this is a new category of device that they need to be aware of. I would hope that they're more proactive as well, but I'm operating in the systems I have, and Republicans are in control of the government half the time, so I got to do what I can do, and I don't want to turn off torts while I don't have better federal oversight. Speaking of mission critical systems, I would hope that there was some better processes in place for the Knight Capital Group, who had an engineer make two mistakes. One, they rolled out the upgrade code to only 7 of the 8 servers. That code also reused an old flag. And so what happened was the 7 other servers started sending commands using the new interpretation of the flag to the 8th server who hadn't gotten the new code and was still considering that flag to mean something else. And so when the 8th server got the new command, it ran that old code and in 45 minutes had processed 4 million trades on 154 stocks for almost 400 million shares. So fairly significant immediate impact. This is not waiting months to find out whether or not the bug surfaced itself in a car or in, your Nest thermostat. This was within 45 minutes of the upgrade. They knew that something massively bad had gone on, to the point that, one company that was affected had their share price go up by $11, which on the stock market these days probably doesn't seem like much, but they started the day trading at $3.50 and ended at $14.76. So a 4x increase in your stock price over a 45-minute bug is pretty phenomenal. Knight Capital ended up having to declare a $440 million pre-tax loss, and that cratered their stock, and they had to go and scramble and do a bunch of stuff because somehow they didn't have automated deployment and someone else, and they were literally having a guy, I don't know, was he walking around with a USB stick from server to server? I don't know that he probably should have been aware, or whoever the engineering team is. I won't just say him, but it was one guy doing the one server badly. I don't know where the other code problems came.
Well, I'm sorry, but in this day and age, maybe he can sue as well and argue like, oh, the processes that I was trained on were not sufficient, so I've suffered I'll never get hired again. I've got the emotional scarring of bringing down Knight Capital. Maybe he can sue as well.
Good. And if he sues and if he makes an example of Knight Capital, then maybe other financial companies will decide to put some things in place. This is what I'm saying is the emotional stress on that dude. I mean, it's Wall Street. The human cost of these things can be real. So yeah, again, if our only mechanism to prevent other corporations from having crappy process in place is to scare them by saying, oh yeah, we don't want to be the ones to get sued. That's the reason why you all have to go and listen to so many corporate HR trainings about all of the things that you shouldn't do in a workplace. I don't know that the corporations, plenty of them care about actually having a good, healthy workplace. A good number of them don't care about that. They care about not getting sued. And so they make sure that legally they've covered themselves by saying, well, everyone got trained on how not to be that person at work, and we can't be sued as a corporation if that does happen. I don't know that those things are for the moral good from leadership. They're from the legal protection perspective.
I kind of think about this, throwing my architecture hat on for a second though, and maybe this is, I don't know if it ever gets solved. Maybe AI fixes it for us. That'll always be my answer.
That's always your answer.
With the markets being electronic, some of these things are a house of cards, right?
They really are.
And nobody's really looking at it proactively to say, hey, these are the 112 things that could go wrong that actually end civilization for the next 2 generations. Everybody's just kind of waiting for the next one to say, well, that was bad. But it wasn't as bad as 7 years ago when it happened, but it was bad.
Right.
This one's scary to me, that there were no triggers, there's no collaboration between the market and Knight Capital.
And how many 401k retirement plans were screwed by this? Too many parts of our society are dependent on this unregulated. I mean, it's highly regulated, but also is the technology sector of it very well regulated? Doesn't seem like it.
And again, this is my challenge. This is where I can play both sides, because I think if you look at the whole collateralized debt obligation and that whole debacle and the market collapse there, we're perfectly happy. Where ignorance is bliss when we're making money, but the minute it costs us, we're not anymore. I think I won't butcher the Latin, but the British legal motto is ignorance is no excuse. People have to be informed. If they're willing to put their money out there, they've got to understand the risks, and some of that is educating themselves and understanding you're both susceptible to market volatility, but you're also susceptible to the technical glitches. And in this case, I'd say these guys definitely screwed up, but no one should be surprised anymore by technical screw-ups, and we can only do our best to diversify ourselves and protect ourselves, right?
But do you have a choice when your company doesn't offer a pension plan, because no one works at companies for 30 years anymore, but they offer a 401k that can be transferred from company to company? But now as an employee, a worker, what's the word I'm trying to look for? I'm not a consumer in this situation. I'm a worker who is forced, and my only retirement option is the stock market. And the stock market is, I'm not making risk trade-offs. That's my only only option. That's not great.
Let me ask you a simple question. Here we go. When you go through a green light, do you still check the junction to see if anything's coming from the directions that have the red light?
Like half the time, especially if the light just changed. Yeah.
So 50% of the time, you are susceptible to getting T-boned. And I would argue that to some extent, you bear some of the responsibility. Because there's never a time I go through a traffic light where I assume that it's clear, ever.
Uh-huh.
So you're trusting technology to tell you it's safe to drive through a junction that has traffic designed to go across. And half of the time you don't stop and check. I always check. Humans, we've got like that, right? We become so trusting of everything, and our guard is down now. And I'm saying, I don't disagree with you. Companies like this need to pay, but it's super naive to be surprised by it. It is naive to be surprised when someone says, hey, by the way, your 401k is gone because of a glitch.
But I made the choice to only look half the time. I didn't necessarily make the choice to drive. We have a car culture, and plenty of people are forced to drive in cities that don't support public transit and aren't walkable. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why you may not actually have a choice to be driving your car at that time. But I am making the choice to only look 50% of the time. I am not making the choice. I don't have a choice to contribute to my 401k. It's a mandatory thing that this company is taking out of my paycheck.
Okay.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
Part of my money has to go to the stock market, and that is the issue I have.
That I agree. When you're being forced to do something, yeah, some people get more burnt than others, right?
Right.
But I still stand by my green light, red light analogy. We have let our guard down.
All right. Well, that's a good transition into our final topic here of horrifying software bugs, which is Toyota with a firmware update that had I need to find another word than horrifying. Had terrible consequences. Between 2000 and 2010, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration received 6,200 complaints about sudden acceleration in Toyotas. It resulted in 89 deaths and 57 injuries. It takes a decade for the government to finally have enough evidence to decide that they're going to go and do something about it. For some reason, they enlist NASA. I guess that's where all of our government nerds work, is in NASA. So I don't know why we don't have our own. I mean, we have airline nerds who work at the NTSB, but apparently cars, you need NASA to look at the software in cars in 2011. Anyway, NASA gets brought in 2011, does a kind of rushed evaluation of the Toyota software. A bunch of weird things about this NASA evaluation don't quite add up. In a lot of cases, they just end up taking Toyota's word for it. So rather than actually going and looking at some of the hardware and validating what Toyota tells them, NASA just says, yep, that's the type of memory they use, which it turned out they weren't using a certain type of memory, and that's important later. The NASA report concludes it didn't find a smoking gun, but couldn't exonerate that system in the Toyota, I think it was a Camry, the 2005 Camry maybe. So NASA says, can't prove it, but we're not saying there's no software glitch. For some reason, in 2011 or 12, the Transportation Secretary under Obama, a Republican, Ray LaHood, says, we enlisted the best and brightest engineers to study Toyota's electronics system, and the verdict is in. There is no electronic-based cause for unintended high-speed acceleration in Toyotas, which is wild. This guy, Ray LaHood, by the way, is a weird mix of Republican congressman who in 2017 admitted that back in 2012 he took a $50,000 bribe and refurbished his house from a foreign government. And, coincidentally enough, I'm sure that next year in 2013 decided not to be part of the second Obama term. And yet also he's like a crazy consumer advocate for airline passengers. He thinks all airlines should give everyone food and water, thinks high-speed rail is the correct solution for our transport woes, didn't support Trump in 2016 or 2020. He's like this weird mix of 1980s pro-business Republican, but also I can kind of see where Obama was coming with this guy, but still wild to hear what NASA said and just give Toyota a blank check and say, you all did nothing wrong. Except it turns out then what we were talking about earlier, you needed a lawsuit, and only during the lawsuit and during discovery from the lawsuit did it turn out they had a guy named Michael Barr, who was an embedded systems consultant firm, came in as an expert for the plaintiffs and reviewed all of the Toyota systems that he actually did real deep dives in a way that surprisingly NASA didn't for some reason. So the ETCS, which is the electronic throttle control system, he qualified the source code of that system as unreasonable quality. The source code was full of bugs, and specifically bugs that would cause unintended acceleration. There were metrics that he used. There's a system called psychometric something or other, and basically it ranks the types of bugs and quality of the code. The overall quality of the entire code base got a score that said of the bugs he found, there were probably even more bugs out there. And his conclusion was Toyota had a house of cards safety architecture that would not provide any meaningful fail-safes. The hardware hardware had a problem. So again, Toyota seems to have lied or misled or something to NASA and told them that the memory did a certain thing, which had backups for safety scenarios when the actual CPU didn't have that type of memory. And so those safety critical systems, I don't know why Toyota didn't just, apparently it's a fairly cheap part to use memory version B instead of memory version A, but Toyota didn't. And so the hardware was at fault, and then the software that was running on top of it. I tried to read his report. I'm an engineer of like front end and web systems, and I can do a little bit of SQL and API work, but I was not hanging with everything that was in this report. But basically, there was a bunch of data mirroring, which caused Stack Overflow issues. It wasn't managing its memory very well. There was no memory protection, ensuring that a bunch of automated tasks didn't just randomly get killed. And so these faults in this software specifically interfered with that throttle control system that was causing all of these unintended accelerations. There were weird race conditions, basically. So the solution that he found was that when your car started to accelerate unexpectedly, the only way to reset the software was to take your foot off the brake. And so no one in their car would logically have decided to, I think a couple of cases where people were pumping the brakes. Pumping the brakes was a thing that was solving it, though there was a bug around pumping the brakes that also caused another condition. And so just the scenarios were incredibly complex and weren't properly tested. One of the other things he found was that the ETCS system, that throttle control system, had 11,000 global variables. And so it was basically spaghetti code trying to interpret all of the overlapping ways that those 11,000 variables could possibly be related to one another. He found 67 functions that were just untestable. There was no way you could properly test them because of all of those weird interdependencies. The throttle angle function was responsible for the unintended accelerations. In his testing, he rated it as unmaintainable. It had over a score of 100 on whatever that scale is. It was just so bad of code that it was the worst score you could get out of a scoring system of code complexity. And then apparently there was no bug tracking system at Toyota. So even had they found some of these bugs, it was unclear how Toyota would have ever been able to resolve that. As part of that investigation, and one of the things NASA noted, there were 5 fail-safe modes, but then when Barr went in to actually investigate how those 5 fail-safe modes worked, they were all handled by the same task. And so if that one task failed due to those memory protection issues earlier, none of the 5 fail-safes would kick in. So single points of failure in incredibly critical pieces of this code all led to cars just randomly flooring it and killing 87 people. I think this goes back to one of our earlier comments. I think if you're at Toyota, you understand the consequences. This is not a situation like the post office where you can't imagine how post office accounting software could have bad unintended consequences a decade later. Here you can. Here, I don't understand how decisions like this get made at Toyota.
Yeah, so the term is cyclomatic complexity, and anybody who's ever used something like a Sonar cube or Sonar should be familiar. I've seen not to the extent of Toyota's. Like I've seen some dodgy statements in the past, even just basic nested if statements, right? Like it starts to get complex, right? When you start to look at the sheer number of paths that code can take, then it gets really complicated. Start to throw in the fact that James and Ed both decide to hey, I pick a switch and I pick an if, and I'm going to nest switches and I'm going to nest ifs. I'm going to put ifs in my switches. So it gets a little crazy. The Toyota one's interesting. Like I can argue whenever I get in my car, I'm aware of the software. I'm an engineer, so I think about that kind of stuff. But yeah, like from a complexity point of view, like the report is how do you get to this point? Is it a project that keeps you building on top of something and the fear of missing the dates and the deadlines? Is it just this continuous push down of we must meet these dates and the quality checks are based on the results, but you're ignoring the complexity and the race conditions? Because at some point someone smart, right, is saying, hey, I worked on this system. They go home on a night and they say, I worked on this system, and there's this very small condition that could occur. Like they think about that stuff, right? But they're like, but it'll never occur. How does somebody? It's a damning report when you look at like the complexity of some of that code.
And I think there's a perfectly valid part of this, which is that complexity is impossible to test. That is, there is no solution. There is not, when your code looks like that, you weren't able to test for all of these scenarios. Now, I'm not sure if that's totally true. I think there was some things that they ran into that they could have identified, like the hardware faults and some other low-level decisions. But there is a valid point point of don't let your code get to that complexity because it will make testing impossible. And so how do you account for when you get into these even more and more complex systems, when you are responsible for missile defense, when you're responsible for car acceleration, when you're responsible for the space shuttle? You fundamentally have to have different controls in place to make sure that your code never reaches that state. And that means everything that you do fundamentally, like this is not on the quite the same scale, but this is a thing Microsoft went through with Windows XP. Windows XP Service Pack 2 was a massive project because the security state of Windows in the early 2000s was so dire and horrible that they stopped all engineering. They stopped any current code process and had to go back to fundamentals and realize the fundamental way we write code has to incorporate security and the web and all of these factors from day one and rewrite a bunch of stuff. And so I do it implies that you can't get away with an MVP that gets piled on top of and then more things come in and then you just let the complexity go crazy.
But then how primitive are our lives in the gap where you build all of those contracts and enforceable contracts, right? Like, because we're talking about regulations, right? I have to build an engine and it must pass this test to this standard. And continually we see companies not do that. So there's a gap, right? There's no enforcement. How primitive are our lives if we shut off everything that could kill us every day that didn't really pass the test? I think we're pretty primitive.
But that's the point, is we shouldn't be, and we all agreed that the government was supposed to help us with that thing because it was a thing that was society-wide, and plenty of things do pass that test. You wouldn't eat meat from a meat factory in the 1910s because you didn't understand what was going on to it in a way that we do now. So the government has done these things to operate on behalf of all consumers to make sure that they do adhere to those standards. What you're arguing for is increased monitoring and regulation from the government to ensure those things so that we all feel safe and comfortable with what we're using. I don't know why that's a bad thing, other than even Democrats want to be corporate friendly and don't want to put red tape in front of people. I'm sorry, there are cases when the red tape is good because the Fitbit we didn't talk about because there's yet another class action lawsuit against Fitbit because the thing was burning people because no one was around to say, hey, did you make sure the thing that's the electronics that comes in skin contact doesn't burn people?
When you buy a lithium battery, you're aware at every point in time that it can explode, right?
You absolutely are not. Nope, the average consumer has no idea that that's true. That is not a warning. Even to the point of even medical things. All of the pharmaceutical ads have to say, this might cause you to bleed because you gotta tell consumers the thing that's going on.
Okay, but if I bought balloons for my child's birthday party, they don't have a disclaimer on the balloon, do not inhale the gas inside the balloon, right?
Yes, they do.
They
balloon. Absolutely do.
Not of the balloon. And I go buy some rubber balloons and I take them and I get them filled up, right? The rubber balloon does not have a warning on it. It has a warning in the store and it has a warning on the
package.
The silver.
It has a warning on the package. Yeah.
On a packet
There's
of
a warning
balloons.
on the package.
Look, on a rubber balloon, right? When I show up to the birthday party and I bring the balloons, there's no warning. I'm just pointing out, we will never live in that world.
But we do live in that world now. You have the understanding and the information is available to you. I would agree that some consumers don't take advantage of that. And in those cases, that's where the gray line shows up, which is I checked the box on iTunes and iTunes agreed that they could steal my entire music library and do whatever they want with it. So I'm agreeing that it's gray lines, but there's a reason that the government is at least trying. They're at least trying. It's better than not trying because then the package would just be the smiling face of a baby inhaling a plastic balloon because they think it's fun. So at least someone's trying to put some warnings out there for consumers and telling consumers, here's where you can expect to see the nutrition information. Here's where you can expect to see the disclaimers. Now, yeah, the thing has 4-point font and that's not great. And I do kind of think there's a bunch of things that I think we should do differently about that, but I will take something over the nothing. The nothing is even worse. So just because it's not as effective and it's not limiting all of these scenarios doesn't mean the answer is stop doing it. It's like people who complain that Y2K was blown out of proportion and nothing happened on January 1st, 2000. That's not true. That's not true. We spent half a decade doing tons and tons and tons of work to make sure nothing did go wrong on Y2K. Just because you saw no bad results at the end doesn't mean that the protections put in place for the years beforehand didn't have an impact. So just because you can't see the fact that most kids don't choke on a balloon doesn't mean it's bad that there's warnings on the balloon package.
Okay, so to summarize here, the French guy was wrong. Uber were right.
No, I won't go that far,
The chili users were wrong. Google Nest.
Nope.
Fitbit absolutely liable.
Fitbit, fun fact on Fitbit, by the way, one of the problems that they had with their pulse oximeter reading is they only tested it on white people, or maybe they did test it on African Americans and people with darker skin, and knew that it wouldn't read their readings through the skin pigmentation. Like, I guess it's like a laser that tries to read through the skin, and darker skin would prevent the laser from doing what it needed to do, and just sold it to everybody anyway. Fun little insights into, tech racism.
So Fitbit, absolutely liable.
Yeah.
Night Capital, systemic of a bigger issue, I think. Having worked on the desks in finance.
I'm assuming the guy got fired, right? The guy who missed the 8th server probably doesn't have a job anymore.
Yeah, but if you're listening, you should reach out to a lawyer because you could probably sue somebody for teaching you. This is the cycle. This is my worry, right? Everybody can sue. Everybody can sue. I witnessed the accident. I can sue for emotional damage. It's like the person who, I don't remember whether I heard it or I read it, but somebody ran over a dog and the most unexpected lawsuit was, and I'm suing you for damages because I'm emotionally damaged because I crashed into your dog and it should have been on a leash, and this person's suing because you killed my dog. It's like, who's in the right? It's a crazy world we're living in. So
I mean, that's not the best example. That's not a bystander trying to sue because they watched a dog get killed and suing for emotional damages. Is probably, that's not the scenario you gave. The scenario you gave was the driver trying to countersue for a dog not being on a leash, which is an interesting part of the argument.
But it never ends, Kevin, because now that person who was watching the accident happen tells the story at a party on Saturday night, and that person is now, it never ends.
But no. You don't get to offer hypotheticals that haven't actually happened. Show me the court where the judge didn't laugh that out the room. So the person was willing to throw away $10,000. The plaintiff had to throw away money, which is not great. I'm agreeing that there are situations where it still costs money. Maybe the court fees should go down. Why we need court fees in these situations?
Yeah.
That I would agree with. But in that situation, the system worked. The judge threw it out because that is laughable. But I'm assuming the judge threw it out because you haven't actually brought me a concrete example where this has happened.
I will find you one.
Okay.
Toyota, I'm tough on this one because I think there's a problem there. I think Toyota absolutely should be paying through the nose, right? My problem with this one is the technology in a car, everything we've been talking about. Anybody who climbs into a car and is not under the assumption that they are in some pretty sophisticated technology, this one's a tough one because this one needs the paradigm to shift, and I don't think it's sustainable to expect automobile makers to reach the levels of guaranteeing people's safety under the current paradigm. There's no way. In the current framework with regulations and testing, there's no way. I don't see that. I think people will still die in accidents like this in another 50 years.
Only because people like you don't want lawsuits to enable action to happen so that you can either prevent the corporation or sue the state. Sue the state of California. Sue the government, the federal government, and say your regulations were insufficient and let this happen.
And I'm okay with that. No.
I'm totally fine with that.
So I don't hate people being sued. I just hate the wrong people being sued, right? And I think punishing...
Why can't they be co-defendants? Toyota
Absolutely.
And the U.S. government.
Yet again, we have a compromise, which is if you're going to sue, make sure you include enough that collectively there's a change. And I don't think harming the automobile industry is enough alone to warrant change.
Sure.
So yeah, sue the state too. That's good.
All right.
See, we've changed the world in one short episode. And there you have it, yeah.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. If you liked what you heard, maybe go and drop 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a nice review. And if you didn't like what you heard, remember the name of the podcast is Jordan Jesse Go. Also, tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there grow by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it. And a friendly reminder that we are always interested in hearing questions directly from you, our listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app updated everything and it's now terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. You can send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com or submit them on the Discord in the User Story channel, and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking a coworker or something. To read articles that we've written on similar topics to the ones we talk about here, head over to the blog at acceptancepod.com. You can also follow us on most apps. We're at acceptancepod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog over there. We're also building a community on Reddit at r/acceptance criteria and on Discord. You can find links to both in in the show notes and on the blog, and I promise we'll be moderating the crap out of them to keep it a nice little slice of the internet. For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at kthomaseuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener, and you can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER. And this has been Acceptance Criteria. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.